When you ask, what is anxiety? Where does anxiety come from? These individuals who present with fear and phobia, which is rampant in kids with autism, right? If you look at these kids, they get overwhelmed in the world, they get anxious, they have weird patterns of fear. Some of them act in an aggressive fashion. Where does aggression come from? Yeah, there's trauma, there's all of those things in adults. Our psychological baggage from the past certainly impacts us. But why is it that some people act in these very irrational fashions that goes beyond the psychology? Where does the OCD come from? Where these kids, for those of you that have seen them, these kids that are extremely clumsy, have poor motor coordination, the sensory distortions. If you've ever paid really close attention, some people will say that, environments are too loud, places are too loud. I can't go to this place because it's too loud, or people have trouble with certain clothing or other things. Where do these things come from? Right. And we just, in our world of medicine, we basically say, well, there are some chemistry imbalances, and we'll use certain medications to help restore that. But when you really dig into it, a lot of these things don't have very good explanations to actually help us understand what the root kind of physiology of those things are. And what I would argue, and really the heart of this presentation, is to bring forth to you information, some of which you may have not yet encountered, that really makes a strong case that ultimately a neuroinflammatory response is behind a vast majority of what we're seeing in our patients, including quite a few of your adult patients. And if any of you ever become interested, for those of you that work with, veterans, when you look at their PTSD patterns, their anxiety and so forth, there's some interesting literature that's outside of my scope, so I'm not presenting on that, but there's some interesting literature that also suggests that PTSD is rooted in inflammation. And why is it that some veterans come back from the same theater of war and they're absolutely fine, and others come back and they are destroyed psychologically? I'm sure all of you have prescribed these SSRIs, and if you have, then essentially you have been potentially treating this very thing that we're talking about. So this one study, and we're going to touch on several, let me get rid of this. Sertraline ameliorates CNS inflammation in these mice, inhibits TNF alpha in these microglial cells. And let me get this to work. There we go. Anti-inflammatory effects of fluoxetine in LPS-stimulated microglia. So that was the title of the study. Fluoxetine significantly inhibited the LPS, and we're going to talk about what the hell this is, induced production of TNF alpha. And I'm sure you guys know that these are very nasty pro-inflammatory cytokines that can trigger a massive amount of inflammation. Two other studies. Fluoxetine protects neurons against microglial activation mediated neurotoxicity, which is part of this conversation. And in this case, these two antidepressants inhibit M1, M1 activation and promote this too. And we're going to talk about what all of this is. But part of why I'm sharing this with you is chances are the vast majority of you, if you've ever prescribed an SSRI, you have actually been treating this neuroinflammatory response without potentially knowing that this is what you were treating. And why is this conversation important? Because one, it helps you better understand why your patients present the way they do, and why some patients present with a level of severity that they do. And I want to give you all some basic tools to start thinking about in potentially testing some of your patients that are interested in doing a little bit more outside of the general scope, presuming your department gives you the thumbs up, to start looking at these patients in a different fashion and light. These are several other studies, and you're welcome to go look in the literature yourself, all saying the same thing, that part of the potential benefit that comes from these SSRIs and why they sometimes takes, 3 to 6 weeks to work is you're actually modulating the inflammatory response within the nervous system, which is how you're getting the benefits that you're getting from these medications. And while obviously we don't know the exact pathophysiology to many psychiatric illnesses, this is one study that says, although this is not well known, there's growing evidence to support the role of neuroinflammation and immune dysregulation in ASD, which can also cause neurotransmitter abnormalities. And we're going to talk about all of this. These are 3 different studies. The first one is a review that shows or suggests that part of the pathophysiology behind the presentation of autism is this neuroinflammatory response, and we're going to talk about the microglia, and this has been documented on postmortem studies and PET scans. And part of my practice, actually, essentially the entire heart of my practice, is being heavily focused on these mechanisms, and through various tools and treatments of all different kinds, including off-label use of antifungals. It turns out itraconazole, fluconazole have very potent immune modulating properties. Part of what I do is actually modulate this immune response, and in that start changing the behavior of these kids. And what I've had kids that are the typical autistic, aggressive, overwhelmed, can't leave the house, freak out, having a host of different issues, sure as hell can't socialize, right? Can't connect. You know that type. In some of these kids, within 2 months of modulation of their neuroinflammatory response, are now kids going to school. They're going to Sunday school, at church, sitting there, hanging out with other people at school. They're approaching other kids. They're no longer overwhelmed. They're no longer freaking out. And, some people would say, well, that's not possible. And yes, if you're using conventional therapeutics, it's not possible. But when you get into this domain, a lot of things become possible, because now we're addressing the pathophysiology in a completely different way at a completely different level. And I'm sure you all have patients, whether they're veterans or other adults, who are suffering tremendously from depression, from anxiety, from all kinds of odd things. And part of what I hope is you walk away with this thing of like, could my patient be having this neuroinflammatory response? And could I do something to help them by modulating this to have a better life? So this is where we start talking about this neuroinflammatory response. So I like this study because it puts it in a very simple, plain language. Anything that disrupts or primes, which basically activates the microglia, increases the vulnerability to essentially all psychiatric disorders. Microglia have been shown to play a crucial role in the genesis and course of depression. These are 3 different studies, highly linked to depression, with clear molecular pathways that are linked to microglial-associated neuroinflammation. Because of the cytokines these microglia release, you can change tryptophan pathways, which is behind serotonin. You modulate dopamine, you change glutamate, which is a highly excitatory compound within the brain, right? It causes a lot of agitation, a lot of hyperexcitability. Significant microgliosis in this postmortem study was found in patients who committed suicide. Why is it that some people are so distorted in their experience of life where they would want to take their own life? Where is that coming from, right? Is that just a chemistry imbalance? Or is there something more to this? And according to this study, it's suggesting that maybe there's more to it than what we realize. And as we talked about before, several antidepressants have been found to affect this, to mitigate this. And part of what you're going to see is this conversation isn't about one cell line. It's not about one pathway. And part of why this becomes so important is this neuroinflammatory response literally changes the entire physiology of the nervous system, which is what this is talking about at the end. One of the things that the microglia do is when they're activated, they start increasing quinolinic acid, something you probably are not familiar with. And quinolinic acid, and you're welcome to take these slides and do your own research on them, is a highly neurotoxic compound that then causes all kinds of other changes to the nervous system. Microglia underpin the physiology to ADHD. If you look at a lot of your patients, what do they have? They don't have one thing, right? They don't just have anxiety. They don't just have depression. Many of them have anxiety and they're highly distractible and they're feeling a little depressed and they've got this and they've got some sleep issues, right? When you look at these things, one of the things we find that's so fascinating is how the same neuroinflammatory response can literally have its tentacles in multiple different diagnoses that we give to our patients. This is another study, strong evidence that the development and function of these neurotransmitters are sensitive to in utero exposure, and that this neuroinflammatory response is in some way, shape, or form responsible for ADHD. And we're going to talk about histamine a little later. This may be tied to OCD, and one of the things that I regularly see in the kids that I take care of is these patterns of intense OCD, rigidity. I have a whole lot of kids that have ritualistic behaviors. They have compulsions. They have to check the door 10 times. They have to wash their hands 15 times. Parents have to do a 10-minute routine that has to be exactly one way. Otherwise, the kid freaks out. And part of why I backed into these studies is as I modulate the inflammatory response, bring it back down to normal, parents find like, oh my God, my kid's OCD and a lot of things disappeared. This is how potentially powerful this conversation is. And I believe that you have all seen patients with weird clinical findings that you're like, okay, that's just part of their OCD. Well, what the hell does that mean, right? It's just part of their OCD. Where is their OCD coming from? And is it just a neurochemical imbalance that we've always been told is all that there is? These are two different studies suggesting that it may even be playing a part in schizophrenia. So what is this brain inflammation and how does it ultimately do what it does? So the microglia, for those of you that are not familiar with them, are the primary immune cell within the brain, right? And their job is to protect the brain in a very simplistic way. But it's not just that they're an immune sentinel of the brain, right? It is not just that they're there to prevent the brain from getting infected or somehow harmed. They regulate brain development, they maintain neural networks, they are playing a role in injury. And if you also start looking at, for instance, post-concussion, host of different things, right? People that start developing memory loss or various psychiatric illnesses after concussions, microglia have also been found to play a role in that. They clean the brain up and basically protect the brain, right? That's their job. So they're essentially the guardian angel protector of the brain. But I want you to just sit in a very simplistic conversation and think about what would happen if this guardian angel suddenly became an aggressor to the brain. And if the microglia are truly responsible for shaping neuroplasticity and connectivity, which they are, and these are two different studies, you're welcome to go look this up on your own, what would happen if these microglia suddenly became really disorganized and essentially went through a morphological change, which they can, right? M1, M2, look it up. And through that morphologic change, not only do they become aggressive, they become highly disorganized. And what if this garden, which is the nervous system with all of its neural circuits, started looking like this? Because of what the microglia are doing to the entire pathophysiology of the brain, because it goes beyond just the circuits. Overactivation of the microglia by way of pathogen exposure during development can result in disturbance of proper synaptic development, circuit formation, and social behavior. Microglia can, these are all different studies. Microglia can disrupt the neural circuitry to induce impairment in the processing and integration of multiple sensory and emotional inputs. Outside of autism, how many adults do you have where they, in their way, are telling you, like, I'm overwhelmed in the world. I feel overwhelmed the second I step into the world. I can't go into this place because it's overwhelming to me. What are they saying? I cannot integrate the sensory information that is coming in from the world. It's not just that because the microglia can also influence the myelin sheath, they can start leading to demyelination, which is one of the things we see in autism. They can start changing postsynaptic calcium levels, which leads to neuronal reactivity or hyperexcitability. They can cause apoptosis. They can trigger glutamate imbalances. And as we touched on before, they can cause abnormalities in quinolinic acid, which can lead to a whole lot of irritability. This is a study, if you ever are interested in looking it up, in the bottom over here. The microglia are not sitting in a little bubble. It turns out that through multiple cytokines, through multiple different neurochemical pathways, they can also trigger excitability in other cells. So when the microglia get activated, it is almost guaranteed that the mast cells within the nervous system are activated, and also the astrocytes within the brain are activated. And it goes vice versa. If something triggers the mast cells, they can cause activation. So it literally becomes this vicious loop of a complex neuroinflammatory response that goes well beyond the microglia. Why is that important? Well, it turns out that the astrocytes also influence excitatory pathways within the brain through modulating glutamate. They regulate GABA, so it's not just glutamate goes up causing excitability. GABA actually starts becoming suppressed. So the braking system, right? You all know GABA, it calms down the brain. That's why people take GABA, right? Gabapentin, for those of you that are prescribed it, is basically pharmaceutical GABA. Why do we need these medications? Why do people have such intense neuroexcitation to the point where you have to prescribe pharmaceutical levels of GABA to calm down the nervous system? It modulates ion response, and it also plays a role in neural circuits. I'm sure you've all heard of oxytocin, right? It is our happy connection chemical, right? It is what we need to feel that ping of connection and joy with others, right? And ultimately, it influences behavior. Give me one quick second. Sorry, guys. Sorry, it was freezing in this office. So it does a lot, right? It regulates social behavior, bonding, et cetera, et cetera. Not only does oxytocin influence the behavior of the mitochondria, the microglia. The microglia, plainly put, regulate oxytocin systems. How did I figure this out or find this article? I started by modulating the inflammatory response in these kids with autism. The weirdest things started showing up. These kids that were totally disconnected, socially, emotionally disconnected, even from their own families, right? They were off in their own world. I'm sure you've seen it. Some of these kids, literally within a few weeks, were going up to their parents and giving them hugs, telling them, I love you. One of them started massaging his mom because she was upset. And the mom was like, what the hell is going on? This is how powerful this conversation is. And these are not abstract conversations. This is what I see in my practice all the time. And part of why I know this science exists is because I went looking and said, how the hell is this possible? Oh my God, look at that. I'm sure all of you are aware of the limbic system in the amygdala, right? That is our primitive brain that essentially helps us process what could be a threat in the world, right? So it processes fearful and threatening stimuli and essentially helps us determine what is a threat and when do we need to respond. And when do we say, yeah, that's not a big deal. That's not a threat. That mouse isn't a threat. That lightning strike isn't a threat. That person walking past me is a threat. None of these things are dangerous, right? What do we see in kids with autism, first and foremost? These kids do not know how to properly gauge what is a threat, right? They go into the world and they're freaking out. So why do they do this stemming? Why do they do all of these things? They're overwhelmed. They're completely overwhelmed. They're threatened by the world. What do you see in people with PTSD? Right? What do we see in these adults where they go into the world and everything is improperly perceived as a threat? That has to do with the amygdala. Stimulation of the brain mast cells or the microglia may disrupt neural connectivity within the amygdala, changing the normal fear threshold. And then if you extend that, where does anger come from? What is anger? Anger is rooted in fear. So when we are fearful, depending on our constitution and our chemistry, right? Some people, when they're fearful, they get anxious and scared. And then you got typically males, right? When they feel really threatened, what do? They become aggressive. These are things that I see in the kids all the time. And what is crazy is the kids who are highly anxious, highly overwhelmed, they're attacking their siblings, they're attacking their parents. A month later, they're now calm as can be. And they're no longer aggressive, they're no longer freaking out in the world because that neuroinflammatory response has started calming down. It goes beyond this. So the mast cells and the microglia can produce up to 50% of the histamine, the central histamine within our brain. Why is that important, right? Well, it turns out histamine also has a pretty significant and profound role in our experience of life. There's a plethora of evidence if I can talk, implicating the histaminergic system to play an essential role in the regulation of neuropsychiatric disorders. It mediates diverse higher functions and plays a role in regulating various functions of the brain, such as sleep, wakefulness, learning, memory, feeding, and energy balance. Abnormalities in this system are closely related to various psychiatric illnesses, from narcolepsy, and you can flip it around, sleep disorders. And I'm sure you've seen plenty of either kids or adults that just either can't fall asleep, or they go to sleep after taking melatonin and 3 hours later you just boom, right, they can't sleep, and then next thing you have to do is put them on clonidine or whatever else you have to use to basically snow them into sleep. Why in God's good earth do you have to do that to someone? Why is it that this human being can't sleep, right? Where do these other things, including Tourette's, come from? What are these motor tics that we see in these individuals, which happen to be very common in kids with autism and or other neuroinflammatory conditions? So histamine is this fascinating compound in the brain that first modulates the vestibular function. What the hell is the vestibular function? If you guys go way back to your pathophysiology, right? The vestibular system is our balance control system, right? It helps us maintain our sense of balance and position in the world. What happens when that main sensory pathway starts becoming distorted? First, you get hyperactivity, right? The kids that are doing this, that they can't sit still, they're fidgeting, they're moving. It changes their not just postural muscle tone, but it changes their motor planning, so they look clumsy as hell. They're just, it looks like they're drunk, right? It further affects our signaling of anxiety, and you can see beyond that sensory gating, right? What do we see in some schizophrenics? And I would argue also with kids with autism. Sensory gating is basically the brain's ability to shut down excess information from the outside world, right? It just controls the amount of sensory input that's coming in. And when that sensory gating is basically flood open, right? What happens? All of this sensory information floods into the nervous system, causing someone to be completely overwhelmed in the world. So I hope you can start filtering this information, because I'm sure you've had many, many patients that you've seen where you're like, what is that? Why do they do this? And I hope you can go back and look at this. And then in the future, as you're seeing your patients, you will see this literally before your eyes. Your patients, in their own way, will tell you like, hey, my sensory gating is completely weird. I'm overwhelmed in the world. Too much information is coming at me and I don't know what to do with it. It influences sleep. It influences food intake. We're going to talk about that. Because histamine essentially modulates the entire HPA axis through ACTH, it can ultimately influence a host of other things. Indirectly and directly, these are animal studies, it can influence auditory pathways. So people that get overwhelmed from loud environments, which is what we see commonly in these kids, balance gets thrown off, motor planning gets thrown off. olfactory pathways get distorted. So the kids with autism, and you may have some adults where literally they can't go into a room where their family is eating because the smell of the food from 5 feet away completely overwhelms them. What the hell is that about? Right? Where do these weird things that we see in real time, in real life, in our patients come from? And I would argue a vast majority of it is rooted in inflammation. And the flip side of it is I get rid of the inflammatory response. The same kid that was completely overwhelmed in the world couldn't be in the same room as families eating are now fine. Histamine plays a key role in attention and vigilance. Now, part of these studies, what they're talking about is too little acetylcholine dopamine causes what? Poor attention, right? So people can't pay attention. What do we see in some kids with ADHD, right? They're hyper distractible, they're completely like frazzled, but then you give them a Lego or whatever that they're interested in, they become crazy hyper focused, right? And they'll sit there for 8 hours and just focus. So these pathways can go in both ways, right? What do we see with some people with anxiety? They're hyper focused, but not in necessarily a healthy way. And I would argue a lot of what you're seeing is this inflammatory response in real time. Histamine can impact working memory. What the hell is working memory? Is what we use to do things like math, right? So working memory is like the RAM of the brain. It takes information in, processes the information, and then spits it out to long-term storage. A lot of the kids, if any of you have worked with children with ADHD, one of the telltale signs of neuroinflammation is this working memory. And if you specifically ask them, how does Johnny do in math? Oh my God, yeah, Johnny was really struggling in learning math concepts. He just, for the life of him, cannot learn math. And we have to repeat the same concept 15 times for him to get it. That is working memory. Executive functioning, I'm sure you all know what that is. Social memory, food intake, and we're going to talk about some of these things a little bit more. The histaminergic system, histamine system, is strongly suggested to play an essential role in modulating sleep and wake behaviors via these histamine pathways. These are two different studies. One of the things that I find in a lot of the kids that I take care of, and some of these kids have intense sleep disruption. Like I sadly have at least 10 patients that I can think of off the top of my head who came to me on some kind of sedative because literally they couldn't sleep and the parents were losing their mind. I get rid of their neuroinflammation, and now these kids start sleeping. And not only do they not need the pharmaceutical, they're able to sleep without even melatonin, which is what all human beings should be able to do. The people who take an hour or two to fall asleep, or they wake up in the middle of the night between 2 to 4 a.m. and either stay up for a while or just can't even go back to sleep, that is histamine in real time showing its face. This same pathway has also been found to be playing an important role in food intake. And histamine is long considered to be a satiety signal. What do we see in some of our patients? And I'm not going to get into the world of anorexia because that's not my expertise, but I do see restrictive eating in a lot of the kids that I take care of. And restrictive eating is a known complication of autism. Where do these restrictive patterns of eating come from? Why is it that the human being doesn't sense hunger, right? Because eating and hunger and food is actually such a normal, healthy part of human being. Where do these things come from? What I find is as I take care of this, the child that either wouldn't eat at all and they're giving them shakes because they just need to get calories in this kid, or the parents are chasing them around and the only thing the kid will eat is chicken nuggets and a slice of pizza, a month or two later is now not just eating healthy portions, but now is eating some fish, some broccoli, and other things because their satiety is changing. Their appetite is finally showing. They're finally experiencing hunger because they're not in this hypersympathetic drive all the time. And if you want to contextualize this in a different way, glutamate and histamine play a similar role in appetite suppression. And for those of you that have done way too much coffee in one day, and then you went through the day and you're like, oh my God, I didn't eat. I forgot to eat. That is a similar phenomenon as what we would see in some of these kids, except histamine is what is driving that. And I would argue in a more intense fashion. While we're not going to talk about mold in a significant way, a lot of my patients have ultimately been exposed to mold. And why I'm including this is it turns out that when you get a histamine imbalance, which commonly happens in those who have been exposed to mold, the various toxins that are released into the environment that these people breathing, it goes into their circulation, it goes up into the nervous system, also have effects that can trigger a phenomenon of anorexia. Upregulation of these histamine receptors can destabilize the entire cortical striatal circuitry and contribute to tics. So these kids that do this, and we ultimately, and you can see over here, histamine is one of the key factors in Tourette syndrome because of the fact that it's not just the histamine receptor, is ultimately what it does to other pathways as well. And these are 3 different studies that are suggesting that histamine is playing a significant role in motor tics. What I find in a lot of my patients is they come in with this laundry list of stuff, motor tics being one of them. We control the inflammatory response. We reduce the mast cell activation, the microglial activation, reduce central histamine. Kids start sleeping better, and their motor tics start going away. These are all rooted in the same pathophysiology. And what's so, I would say, fun about this conversation is you can make so much more sense of what your patients are presenting with when you start looking at them in this way. These authors go on to say, we believe an in-depth investigation involving the histaminergic system should be looked at in autism, and I would argue in many other psychiatric illnesses. So now the question is, what the hell triggers all of this, right? So it's not one thing. It could be Lyme. So for those that are living in parts of the country where Lyme is endemic, and you can argue that California has some of it, people who have been exposed to heavy metals, other compounds and chemicals, COVID is a really nasty trigger of inflammation. And you may have some patients where they're like, you know what? I was doing fine, and then I got this fever, and I was really exhausted. And since then, I've been just not myself, right? And they're either aggressive or they're anxious or they're having trouble sleeping, and they've got this constellation of weirdness. COVID and influenza, I would argue, as a secondary, are highly capable of triggering this inflammatory response. Parasites, for those people that go swimming in some fun lake somewhere in Montana, they were in a cabin, they went swimming, and they got some diarrhea, and then a month later, suddenly they're anxious or they've got weird things going on, and I've seen this. Parasites are highly capable of not just triggering mast cell activation within the gut, but ultimately microglial activation within the nervous system. And even air pollution could do it. My world is focused on this. So when there is water penetration within the home, and not always do you see this kind of mold, you get this soup of biological toxins, including mold toxins. But more so, what's terrifying is actually what happens to the bacteria. So there's a overabundance of gram-negative bacteria that start growing, which end up releasing a host of these bacterial endotoxins, including microbial volatile compounds and particulates. These trigger a massive amount of inflammation in the nose. So one of the things you may find in these patients is not just that they're anxious, but they're chronically congested, and they've got allergy symptoms, and they've got, respiratory issues, and they get sick all the time, and they're coughing up sputum, and you're putting them on Flonase, and you're putting them on antihistamines, and they're still pouring mucus out, and they're anxious, and they can't sleep, and they've got sensory issues, and they're depressed, on and on. So you can see how all of these things start coming together, because it's not just, oh, there's mold and there's one mold toxin. These are actually the lesser problems. These bacterial and the particulates that they release are the scary thing. So what are these lipopolysaccharides? So endotoxins, I'm sure you all know of them in septic shock, right? Septic shock is mediated by severe endotoxemia. But it turns out that endotoxins in particular, and mycotoxins to a lesser extent, the mold toxins, can trigger a really powerful activation of the microglia through these, they call them toll-like receptors. Because when these toxins make it into the brain. Essentially, those immune sentinels are freaking the hell out. They're like, what the hell is going on? What is this? The brain is about to become infected. We need to do our job to protect, right? I mean, you think about it from a just simple pathophysiology, and it makes complete sense. And it turns out that that's the case. Where is the most significant source of these endotoxins? The environment could be a part, but it's the gut. So when you get damage to the gut, that directly through various pathways, including the vagus nerve, can trigger activation of the nervous system. But it turns out that when the gut becomes disrupted, these lipopolysaccharides, which are basically these glycolipids that are on gram-negative bacteria, can start translocating into the systemic circulation. And the more messed up someone's gut is, right, the less healthy it is, the more toxic these lipopolysaccharides are. And it turns out that these lipopolysaccharides are the most potent pro-inflammatory neurotoxin known. So imagine you've got this dam, right? This is the gut. This is the gut bacteria with all the toxins. This is the healthy gut barrier, which is controlling everything. You shoot some rockets into this, aka toxins, chemicals, stress. And then all of a sudden, this dam starts becoming breached, and a whole lot more water, aka lipopolysaccharides, start entering into circulation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into this too much, other than the fact that just about anything and everything in our modern world could disrupt it, from various chemicals. These xenobiotics are basically exogenous compounds. So antibiotics, heavy metals, pesticides, artificial sweeteners, various plastics, phthalates, glyphosates. Again, COVID. So not only can COVID trigger a whole lot of inflammation directly within the nervous system, I've had a whole lot of kids where COVID was the reason why their gastrointestinal function basically became derailed. And it triggered not just inflammation in the nervous system, but within the gut, causing, right here, microbial translocation, ultimately triggering nasty amounts of inflammation. Air pollution can do it, and mold toxins can do it. Where do most of our modern antibiotics come from, right? Penicillin came from penicillium. And it turns out these mycotoxins are also pretty great at disrupting the microbiome, but also causing leaky gut. And at the end of the day, part of this slide is to help demonstrate to you that it's not one thing, right? Sadly, in our modern world, everyone is exposed to glyphosates. Everyone has some degree of exposure to heavy metals. You add some processed foods, some plastics, COVID, air pollution, you get this soup of toxicity that is eroding the health of our population, creating this endemic or epidemic, I would say, of neuroinflammation that is unfolding before our eyes. And since COVID, what I have seen in the kids is a even more significant spike in the severity and prevalence of this very thing that we see that we're talking about here. Ultimately, multiple layers of the gut get disrupted. We don't need to worry about that too much. So too much circulation, for those of you that have worked in the ICU and you've had the misfortune of seeing what septic shock looks like, is ultimately LPS just pouring through, right? Dam completely blows open. You get massive amounts of LPS. They shut down everything from the mitochondria to multiple organs, and literally the entire body just boop, turns off, right? It turns out that even small amounts, so a single perinatal exposure to these poor mice, could induce long-term activation of the microglia. Even in healthy adults walking around, they have a tiny bit of LPS, which even in amounts that is floating around in healthy adults, and in this case, what they did is, I don't know how the hell they managed to pull this off. They took adults and injected them with LPS so they can have a controlled amount of exposure. And what they found was that on PET scans, you would actually see this microglial activation. So this is part of what we see for those of you that are taking care of adults with neurodegenerative disease. We see that this is a beautiful study by Brown. I would encourage you guys all to take a look at it. It is such a well done, well written article that gets into this in a lot of detail. But it really raises the question of, and they didn't include Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases, which I think should be there, because if you go and do the literature search on Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases, they also are right here. What's really spooky is there's only one study that I've been able to find on autism, and what it is suggesting is kids, or these were adults with severe autism, actually had levels that were somewhere over here. And this difference that we see in these severe autistics versus the healthy controls, because they were living on a farm where there are endotoxins. So this is all their gut that is leaking endotoxins into their body. People that have this, they feel tired. They don't really have much interest in engaging with others. They look depressed, right? And look at your patients. What do you see in some of the ones that are severely depressed, right? We say, oh, severe depression is just a chemistry issue. Is it? Or is it actually the mitochondria and energy production are shot? Their entire brain physiology is completely messed up, and you've got multiple different things going on. And the most important part of this is something we can treat, and if we ever get intentional enough, even prevent. Perinatal infections that are associated with autism may be ultimately driven by endotoxins. So what do we see? So this is what I see in a lot of little kids: gnarly colic early on, reflux that goes way beyond the regular realm. These kids start developing food sensitivities, food allergies. They start having eczema. They start having a lot of ENT issues. What about your adults? I said childhood, but you can extend this into this. You don't always get gastrointestinal issues. And this is a mistake that people make. Like, you have to have frank diarrhea and bloody diarrhea for people to have some kind of compromised gut function. That's not true at all. But when you see these weird patterns of OCD and phobias and sensory distortions and fatigue and just brain fog, and they can't think, and they're, the highly successful professional that was, a attorney or whatever, can't even function now. You need to start thinking about this endotoxemia. You need to start thinking about this neuroinflammatory condition. For those of you that have those poor, severely debilitated adults that can't function, and you've tried every medication under the sun and they're barely making it, you need to start thinking about this. So what do? This is where we are right now. So I don't want to lie to you and make it seem like, oh my God, we've got the perfect tests that you can do on patients that's going to directly identify this. It doesn't exist. Through regular labs, you're not going to see any of this. So just because you did a CBC, CMP, and whatever else, like, you would never see this on any of those labs. There's no way to directly assess endotoxins because they have a half-life of 3 minutes. So outside of a research center where you draw, you test, you find the results, you're going to miss this. What can you look for? So these are the labs that I do, and I can only talk about the kids that I take care of. So when the gut is severely compromised, one of the things it triggers is anti-nuclear antibodies. So one of the ways you can indirectly test for gut function is by running an ANA. And if one of your severely debilitated adults with whatever they have has an ANA of 1 to 160 or higher, you may need to step back and say, shoot, is this person's gut and immune system going completely sideways? Because the thyroid is this naked organ that is highly susceptible to the immune system. If you start seeing thyroid antibodies, that means that entire person's immune system is probably more dysregulated than they realize. Sometimes you get iron deficiency and zinc deficiency because the more compromised the gut becomes, the less effectively these minerals are absorbed. So if you start seeing this pattern, these are all telltale signs that there's inflammation and likely gut disruption. If you are able to do so, and this is where you may need to go back to your department heads, through various companies, you can actually check immune reactivity against these various compounds. This is one of the tests. I have no financial affiliation with any of these. There's a company called Rupa Health, Rupalpa Health. that actually, like, you can set up an account and they can basically automate all of this. But for $100 and a finger prick, you can actually, is it the most perfect test? No, but is it pretty reliable for what it is? Yes. You can actually look for immune reactions. So zonulin, occludin, which you see here, are tight junction proteins. They're the glue that keep our intestines healthy. When something disrupts the gut, the immune system starts mounting immune reactions against zonulin and occludin, which these tests pick up. If the immune system is reacting against candida, and you can see against lipopolysaccharides, that is obviously not a good thing, right? Because the only reason why the immune system would start mounting an antibody response against lipopolysaccharides is because the dam is broken. And while I can't use these tests in kids very often because their immune systems are completely wacky, it turns out that they're much more reliable in the adults that you're taking care of. So for some of those poor patients that you have where you've tried everything under the sun and they're suffering and they're still debilitated, you may want to start talking about using some of these tests to start seeing how often this shows up. Because Candida albicans, I'm going to rush through this for the sake of time. Because when the gut becomes disrupted, the commensal Candida albicans becomes invasive, right? It starts forming hyphae. Its job is to flourish. So when the gut is disrupted, it says, hey, party time, let's go at it. It turns out that you can actually use other biomarkers as a way to gauge the dysbiosis, the dysfunction within the gut, because it turns out that gliadin, even though we think of it as our celiac marker, happens to have immune cross-reactivity against candida. And you can see these are 4 different studies, just for the sake of completeness, that all basically say the same thing, that when you see gliadin, that may actually be indicating an overgrowth of candida or other molds, which would only happen when the gut is sufficiently disrupted. So you can actually run these regular tests to indirectly start inferring what's going on. The ASK antibodies, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, IgG, IgA, we use that for Crohn's, right? That is one way to look if there's an issue with Crohn's. Well, if you say, well, what the hell is this test looking for? This test is looking for if a yeast, aka Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is pissing off the immune system, right? That's what this test is saying. So why would the immune system start becoming irritated by a yeast? There's only one condition in which that would happen, if the gut is compromised, right? So I actually, in the patients that I take care of, and you can see there are multiple studies over here, not just one, that again say the same thing, that Saccharomyces cerevisiae basically looks the same as candida and various other fungi and molds. And the only reason why the immune system would react is when the gut is compromised. So if your department or others say, you know what, no, we can't do these specialty tests, but they'll let you run these tests. These are tests you can start running to start identifying these dysbiosis and gut compromise in your patients. The most important part of this conversation is there's so much more we can do to help these patients. I mean, the reason why I've gone down this road is I believe there's always more we can do to help. And for those of you that have worked with families whose kids have severe autism, I mean, the hell that they go through, the hell these children go through is unimaginable. It's unfathomable. And I'm sure you all have adults that are living in a similar type of hell where every day is just a nightmare. And there's so much we can do to help these patients if we start stepping outside of our box and start looking at this plethora of psychiatric illnesses that we see from a different light. We can prevent it. There's so much we can do to help if we just start looking at it in a different way. And with that, I thank you guys for taking the time to pay attention and take this in.